We talk to a lot of clients, and John, being in San Francisco, is right in the middle of the agent landscape. And here's what we're hearing and seeing. New tools are letting developers create software dramatically lower costs. Software costs are going to zero potentially. Folks are now getting software out the door faster than ever. Things that used to take months are turning into days or even hours of effort. Just a few years ago, a few short years ago, if we wanted to ship a product, we'd probably be thinking about getting 10 people. It'd probably be a year of work. Today, I can see tiny teams, real tiny teams, one or two people getting out there in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the budget. You even hear pundits say, what may be overly optimistic things, perhaps one person companies, one with $1 billion in revenue. Whether that happens or not, these are the things that we're hearing out there, and we're starting to see things like this pop up. So, welcome to the Agentic Mesh podcast. My name is Eric Broda, coming from Toronto, Canada.
And I'm John Miller, coming from San Francisco.
And our topic today is the emerging agent economy. Who wins in this world and how? So here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about what's happening right now with software costs and delivery times. We're seeing collapse, spoiler alert. And we're seeing these things not just driven by better tools, although tools are a core piece of the puzzle. But what we're seeing behind the tools and what we're seeing more prevalent is these software agents that can actually do work on our behalf. So we're going to talk about some of the opportunities. What can you do if you spin up a fleet of agents and you can do this quickly? And these things write code, test code, move data, maybe even talk to customers. What happens when the cost of hiring these digital workers, hiring in quotes, I suppose, what happens when it becomes really easy and quick to hire these digital workers and get them going? However, what we're also going to talk about is the obstacles we're seeing at clients in the field. There's obviously a whole bunch of things that are holding people back. We're early stages, but culture plays a role. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the data challenges that are predominant. We're going to talk about the reality of legacy systems, the tech debt, and the complexity that they leave. These are all things that are going to be holding people back, but we're also going to try and talk about some solutions. Where can agents sit inside your process today? How can we design guardrails around them? And what does it look like to move from experimenting with AI to deliberately building an agent ecosystem or an agent economy? Now, this whole discussion, John, as you know, started when you were out at a meetup, or anyway, you had a field report that you thought was really, really important to share. Is with the Agentic, if I'm not mistaken. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened there and kind of some of the epiphanies you got?
One of the interesting examples of an agentic startup is actually a company named the Agentic. So when I went in September, what I found was that not only do people believe in this vision where one person, a solo entrepreneur or solopreneur, can actually start a company and build a vertical solution custom designed for a very specific business issue, could actually be enabled by this company, the Agentic, and they provide the CTO, they provide the engineers, they provide the low-cost models that can be fine-tuned or specifically designed for one business problem, is something they offer to the market. And what was fascinating about this event I went into in September and then again in October and most recently last week was that they've had at least 70 plus startups come to them that have been approved, and they're building agentic solutions for vertical industry solutions. And some of the examples, one that really got my interest was this idea of credentialing doctors. Apparently, it takes months for a credentialed medical professional to be onboarded in a hospital because they need to go through a process of due diligence and understand, this person has these skills and they map to these sorts of procedures. And I'm not a doctor, as you can tell, but what you will find is that it's a real problem. And one of the startups that won the award that night in September was really going after that one issue of credentialing medical professionals and lowering the time it takes, because every extra day is another day that medical professional isn't working in the hospital. So here's a very, very specific idea accelerating or compressing the time to be a credentialed doctor and actually saying, hey, let's go build the solution. So, what I find fascinating about this is precisely what we're talking about. Startups with one person with a great idea. She's been working on it for a number of years. She finds a company called the Agentic, and they're helping her go to market. And what I find fascinating about that is this level of experimentation and enabling one person to go try an idea in market in 4 to 8 to 12 weeks. That's unheard of and brilliant. And so when I think about this agentic economy, what we're seeing is that there might be millions of points of light where every individual is taking something to market. So I think that's one of the reasons that today's podcast is so compelling to me is that, hey, we're all going to be able to potentially go to market with an idea that can actually solve a business problem. And so we go from this idea of issue to outcome in a mind-bogglingly short amount of time. So let's get into it.
Perfect. So just winding it back a bit, the reason this was so compelling, as you highlighted, is I think I actually went to the website for those that want to go there, theagentic.ai. And I went to their site and read through some of the blogs. But their thing is you can go from idea to product in 12 weeks, which is unheard of. So when you think about how it was then, and I'm going to say then as in 2, maybe 3, 4 years ago, not that long ago, we had to do things very differently, didn't we, John? We had you had to get some financing because you had to find 10 people, and you had to fund them for a year to a year and a half to actually get from idea to product. So some pretty radical stuff.
Now, Eric, let me add a little bit of flavor to that, because when we talk about 10 people to build a startup, most people in the Bay Area would object. They would say, well, wait a second. What are you crazy Canadians talking about? What if entrepreneurs here in the Bay Area would say is that maybe two people, a couple of founding engineers, somebody that would help with go to market. So I don't want to say that we believe we're going from 10 to 1, but we're going from a small group of people to everything you need without having to find an agentic AI engineer, right? They provide that service so that startups can get going without all of that technical capability that's required to build an agentic solution. So
yeah, obviously things are. My experience in Toronto is obviously a little different than San Francisco. Hopefully, we'll catch up to what's going on down there. But this does suggest, this isn't just a productivity boost. What we're talking about is really, I mean, I don't normally like to go with too much rhetoric. I leave that for the cold open, but we're seeing a collapse in both the time and the money required to build software, which leads to an obvious question, I suppose. If you got this much leverage, what is changing? What is going to change? And I think the second question related to that is if you're a leader who's responsible, whether you're in a big firm, little firm, a startup, whatever the case may be, does this create change, the upheaval, literally upheaval today, tomorrow, or some distant time in the future? And when do I actually have to act? In fact, John, if I'm not, my opinion is I think we're looking at something much bigger, and that's what we're calling the agent economy. So is my rhetoric dialed up a little too high? Am I at 11, as they say, or
no,
what do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. We don't claim ownership on the economy. We're not economists, and we use the term liberally. But I think what we're seeing is this idea that we can have, instead of an oligopoly of just a few tech giants that are building all of the solutions that we're all forced to buy or rent, software as a service, we're actually going to see a plethora of custom software development to tackle very specific business issues. And so I really think that what that does to the economy is going to be fascinating. And so that's the provocative statement that I love that we're talking about is if creating custom software is easy to do and everybody can do it, what does the world look like as a consequence of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about this agent economy. I'm going to put out a definition. You tell me what you think. The agent economy is, as I see it, is where a lot of work, and I'm going to use it ambiguously, a lot of work is done by software agents that used to be done by people, but the agents can observe, decide, act. They're not sitting passively behind a chatbot user interface. They're actually out there doing real work behind the scenes, ambiently. And when we start to see a lot of those having the impact that we just talked about, reduced software costs, accelerated delivery times, we believe that we're going to start to see not a little bit of work. And of course, we crawl, walk, run, as they say, but the destinations where we see a lot of work actually done by software agents. So, I mean, if you think about the logical implications of what we've talked about, cost collapse, speed of delivery, but not just speed of delivery, but the speed of iteration, the ability to test stuff, to experiment, is also going up. Or the speed is going up, and the time to iterate, time for a single iteration, the time for a single experiment is I don't know if I'm probably exaggerating a bit, but it's going to zero. And that gives organizations big and small an opportunity to try things out much more frequently. You don't have to wait a year before you get some customer feedback. You can probably try things not in a month, not in a week, maybe if you're really aggressive, maybe in a day, maybe even less. So that's a pretty radical change. So when we think about this for, what's the impact on developers and teams, it almost feels like we're giving people a superpower. It's a superpower where you have literally, again, if we take the analogy of agents like people, your team size is not necessarily limited. And if you can scale and you can have those agents actually deliver the stuff you're expecting, perhaps better, faster, cheaper, we're talking about the ability to actually orchestrate ecosystems or business processes, at least within businesses at light speed. That's pretty darn incredible. Now,
That sounds
go
pretty
go ahead.
good. That sounds pretty good. Let's talk about some of the challenges because or the obstacles to getting to that place. I think that it's true that experimentation time is going to go way down. But one of the things that is always a challenge, unless you're a brand new startup, is this ability to organize your teams and your data and your infrastructure to go build all of these things. And I think there's a lot of current limitations large organizations have to realize the benefits of this accelerated innovation or accelerated experimentation.
Absolutely. In fact, it reminds me of a line by, I think it's attributed to William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And that gets directly to the point that you mentioned, where we may see startups in San Francisco leveraging this and actually living the dream, as it were. But when we look at companies perhaps in Toronto or New York or Paris, they're running into some really concrete obstacles. I mean, we're talking about data challenges, skills gaps, organizational control considerations, obviously. And I mentioned it earlier, you know, complexity and tech debt. There's not a company that I've worked at that hasn't got an enormous amount of tech debt that introduces complexity that slows things down. And of course, there's that thing we call culture and how do we manage change in an organization. I want to drill down on each of these, but John, you are a data nerd, self-described data nerd. So
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to opine on the data challenges that you see that are holding back, big firms, medium firms that you don't see necessarily in startups, but as a practical reality in the vast majority of firms that are out there. So tell me, data nerd expert, tell me what these challenges are.
Yeah, so I think that the culture of the Valley or the Bay Area is really about everything is greenfield. Now, no, that's not every case, but a lot of the agentic AI startups assume that they're going to come in, drop in a new application, and it'll be the first one that brings together a solution. And they often design new processes with agents that don't take into consideration 50 years of tech debt that most organizations have, or 20 years, or even a decade of tech debt. So what I see here is this optimism that we can do anything with agents. And the reason I do consulting outside of the Bay Area is that not everybody lives in that world. And probably the hardest challenge to overcome, which data professionals are well suited to help with, is finally spending the time it takes to understand how we're going to take the principles of data governance and trust in data and apply that to trust in AI. And so most organizations would say, we would love to run this business experiment, but I can't get the data, or the data I have is locked into, some of it's in this mainframe system, some of it's in a Postgres database. I'm not really sure about this system, but I know there's a SQL Server database that has something. And the data landscape at these organizations is so messy that creating an agentic mesh sounds more like creating an agentic mess where you just keep adding more and more applications, each with their own silos of data. If we don't think of data more holistically in organizations so that we can take advantage of it for AI, those organizations are just not going to be able to move quickly. And so I think the thing we data nerds have been saying for a long time, and we've tried to find better ways to say it, is, and be more, reduce the friction in using your data, is to actually make it available in a systematic way, which is not lost on the author of a book called The Data Mesh Implementation, which is partly how we got started working together on your authorship and writing experience.
Absolutely. Now, this data problem reminds me. You probably remember also at a very large client in Toronto about 10, 15 years ago, I'm going to say. But there's this thing we called the S diagram, which was the system diagram, which was so complex that a senior executive printed it on a 4x8 piece of paper, so that you could actually make sense of it. We call it, like I said, it was the S diagram, because we also called it the spaghetti diagram. And I think you remember that. But that is just a simple indication that if you actually took your data landscape, your application landscape, and actually tried to figure out what is talking to what, you'd get something that is more akin to a spaghetti diagram than a systems diagram. That's the data challenge made real, and we see that as a fundamental obstacle. I want to talk about a few others and get your opinion on these, John. So there's a skills gap that we see. I mean, whether it's data professionals that need to update their skills, that need to bring in some AI talent, haven't got it on the existing team, even have difficulty finding it in the market. These are all very practical challenges that are an obstacle to actually moving forward. So think about it. If we're advocating this agent economy, it's not just agent skills you have to have, but it's AI skills. And as we just talked about, you have to have some data skills and capability to actually address some of the data challenges that we have. How are folks in the Valley addressing that? Now, I know they're smaller teams, which maybe they don't see it, but in your travels, maybe outside the Valley, how are folks actually addressing that?
Well, as most people know, there's an incredible race to buy all of the people with skills in deep AI research. So that is one example of paying for those skills. For most of us, we don't have, or most organizations don't have, the financial capital to buy all of these great engineers and put them in one place to go solve a problem. And so that's what was interesting about that company we mentioned before, the Agentic. They say, hey, let us do the engineering work, let you come with the business solution. I think the other thing that's happening around the skills gap is that because there isn't a series of best practices, we're all learning as we go. The best way to increase your skills with AI is to use AI and do more experimentation. And so what I see here is this competition for skills, but it's not something that is easy to solve. What most AI professionals have done is taken the time to learn themselves. How do you apply AI to your profession? And this is something I've personally spent quite a bit of time at with the DAMA Los Angeles team. I was talking about this in August of this year. How do how do data professionals learn about AI? And I think that's the way to think about it. You're in a professional organization. What can you learn about how AI can help you? And one of the most important ways to do it is to try, because there's not a lot of experts out there. Even though there's a lot of us talking about it, there's not a clear path for everyone to follow to exploit the power of AI.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing that I've run across in my travels is, especially started, I saw it in earnest with data products and data mesh. And now starting to see it come out loud and clear on agents and the agentic mesh or the agent ecosystem. Is this question around control, more specifically the potential need to actually change the control structure or give up control. So in data mesh and data products, the whole theme was around federating data, and the distinct discomfort that organizations had with data products and data mesh was being able to give up control and allow data to actually be federated, have ownership of data be federated across the organization. We're seeing somewhat similar things evolving in the agent landscape, but they're even more acute. If you think about what's happening in the agent landscape, we're actually talking about, depending on how organizations approach this, they are augmenting people with agents. Those agents can probably give superpowers to individuals, but they're also not hiring people. They're building agents instead. And then you have the situation where people do not want to give up control, fear the agents. And some of that is very reasonable and understandable. But the whole notion around what happens to my job, and what control do I lose or relinquish to actually do that is a very practical, but it's a very real problem. And what this does, what I see is the decision-making cycles, the decision-making process grinds to a halt. Inability to resolve control structures, which by their very necessity require multiple senior people in the organization to actually come to some common resolution, is plain and simple a hard challenge. It's a hard problem to solve. Where's your head at?
Well, maybe it's useful to ground it in example. I remember the conversation we had with the global compliance or risk officer for a very large bank. Uh, what was fantastic about that conversation, I think we had it in 2023,
Mm-hmm.
hot off some great agentic solutions at a retailer. We said, hey, global risk officer for a bank, why don't we run some experiments? We can see this capability. And that same bank in 2025 has still not implemented any AI agents in its customer facing interaction with customers, because the trustworthiness of a bank is predicated on their brand. And if somebody lost confidence in a bank, the bank would have a run on its deposits and would disappear. And we've seen examples of that. So this unwillingness to take big risks with their customers is something that I think we're going to see until we get to a place where we can feel that we can trust AI to interact with our customers or our employees in a trustworthy way. I just want to point out that I think it was just last week in the New York Times, they were talking about toy merchants who have released toys that allow kids to interact directly with ChatGPT. This is the worst idea possible. And so small random manufacturers might do silly and horrible things with AI in their toys, and they've taken their products off market. But real companies that have reputation and brand can't take these risks that these fly-by-night or small startups can take. And there's
Yeah.
plenty of examples of that.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of reminds me, is going to get us. I remember hearing probably about 5 to 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, but in that time frame, this notion of a digital divide. Those parts of a country or parts of the globe that had access to digital services, and the parts of the organization, company, or region, country, globe did not have it. And that was a really big problem. It's still a big problem today. I think what if you put all these obstacles into focus, there is an emerging agentic divide that's actually happening where perhaps in San Francisco or small teams are quietly building stuff at light speed, and they are literally entering and becoming part of the agent, where others have to watch from the sidelines. They have too much technical debt. There's too many cultural issues or organizational issues around divvying up control. But ultimately, what ends up happening is we're starting to see not just the emergence of the agent economy, but the agent divide, where certain organizations are taking the challenge, accepting what they need to do, and actually getting on with it really, really quickly. And there's others that are, whether they're consciously holding back or they're sidelined by some of the obstacles that we've said, there's an emerging agent divide. What's the perspective in San Francisco around that? Is it just something that I'm seeing perhaps outside of the bubble, if you will, or is this a practical thing that you're seeing too, or is it a concern?
Well, teach me how you're thinking about it. So, uh, I want to be clear on the question I'm trying to answer. I'm not sure I follow exactly what you're asking me.
Yeah,
Can you say that another way so I can understand?
yeah. So what we're seeing, so we have this digital divide, haves and have-nots. And I'm starting to see this notion of an agent divide. Organizations that can take advantage of agents and build and participate in the agent economy. And then there's some that, whether they're mired in tech debt, control issues, or otherwise, that are not. So here's I guess maybe I'll pose it as a hypothesis, is if we believe, and I do believe, that these, once you can start to build stuff faster, better, cheaper, and you can expand your use of agents, you will actually continue to move even more faster, better, and cheaper than you did before. And it's an potentially exponential opportunity for those that start. For those that don't, they'll be left behind. Okay. They will not achieve the benefits. If you are in the position of taking small teams and exponentially magnifying their capability, in a very short while, you will have skills, capability, outcomes that will far exceed those that are stuck. Now, I think there's a huge impact to society in general, future of work. What is the feeling in San Francisco? Where's your head at? What have you heard?
Well, there's a term that's been used a lot, especially when we were talking about whether we should accelerate AI adoption or not. Almost everybody here has come to this, or the venture capitalists, the money in the valley is all about acceleration. And so they're called the accelerationists. And this idea that we're all going to eventually figure out how to do this safely is kind of the ethos here. We'll figure out all of the trust issues as they come up. And I think what we're seeing here is that every company, because it's mainly the industry is tech and a lot of it is software, it's a lot of other manufacturing as well, semiconductors. But in the software industry, everybody's going full in and running the experiments to measure whether their consumers are actually going to use their agents. And so some of the biggest players in the industry, the big software as a service providers like Salesforce and ServiceNow and Oracle and SAP, they're all in the agent economy. They're all suggesting that companies that are spending millions of dollars every year on their software will continue to pay them, and they'll offer agents. Now, there's an open question about how well they're doing with those agents and whether any of that is actually making a material impact. But I think the accelerationist view of how to think about AI and AI agents dominates everything we do here in the Bay Area. I find alignment companies and trust companies are usually headquartered outside of the Bay Area, is my experience.
Yeah. Well, I think this really, by the way, I agree strongly with what you're saying. I would probably put myself in that accelerationist camp, but it does suggest that there's a strategic question that our listeners probably need to think about. And I don't know if it's necessarily, should we try agents? I think that's a foregone conclusion. at least in my mind, and I think we're starting to see a lot of folks start to recognize that there's some significant opportunities. It's not should we try agents, it's actually where specifically in our workflow do agents belong, and more specifically related to that is under what what are the guardrails that they actually need to operate in? How do we actually do this safely? So not only can we go fast, we don't want to go fast and break things. We want to go fast, but we want to go fast properly. It's kind of like the analogy is I love when I'm riding on the road and I'm going fast, but there's a reason why there's stoplights, because when there's cross traffic, you got to get to the other side safely. So yes, you want to go fast, but there's also very practical reasons for guardrails, which leads me to, I think the last thing we said we would talk, but what are the solutions that'll help folks accelerate their journey to the agent economy? How can they actually solve some of these data challenges, control challenges, et cetera, that we talked about? What is it that where should people actually start? Let me pose that question to you. Where do you think people should start? I mean, I got a few ideas, but tell me what you think.
Well, what I've heard consistently is trust is the biggest problem in AI. There's a lack of trust. And until we solve that, I think we're going to see very small pockets of adoption. And let me use the analogy of software and software testing. Everybody likes to build software. Software developers love to build it. They hate testing it. It's generally considered busy work after. It's not considered the primary purpose is to do test-driven development. Now, I'm misusing a software development methodology to make my point, but testing is something you do after you've developed the product. With AI, trust requires evaluation of the results. And as one of my colleagues once said, it's the broccoli of data science. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to talk about evaluation, but you've got to eat your broccoli and you've got to measure whether you can trust the agents. And that happens at multiple levels. If you think about an organization, it's usually, if you think about an organization as just individuals, the employees, their managers and directors, and then senior executives, if there's 3 levels, the person that actually knows about the AI agent is probably that data scientist or engineer that's working with it. Well, their definition of trust and whether that agent is working is probably or is completely different than what the senior executive wants. Senior executives and board members want reliability and they want specific outcomes. Well, an AI agent is non-deterministic, which means we don't know. It is unpredictable by definition. So how does the trust that the senior executive needs and the trust that the person who knows the technology needs, how do we align that? Usually that's the job. That's why we have a middle layer. We have a director that explains to the senior executive, I promise that my team will do this. And the team members say, but it can only do this. And so that balancing of what constitutes trust and what is a valid response or a valid AI output is actually rather complicated. And I think that the more we learn about evaluating and testing AI is some gross oversimplification, but I think that's where where organizations need to spend time. And the only way you get to trust something is if you understand it. And I've found this in my career with security professionals. If the security team doesn't understand what you're doing, they're never going to approve it. And so we all need to learn how to think about trust, but we can't get to trust until we understand how these things work. And so I think it's that experimentation is required, but it needs to be in sandboxes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing you're highlighting is the fact that maybe we ought to be using agents so we can actually accelerate and iterate and experiment to allow us to do that faster so we can actually get to the agent economy. I'm kind of dog fooding it, I suppose, which is kind of interesting. I want to talk a little bit about where do you start? So not to diminish the challenges that we mentioned, but some of those are common to all large projects or transformation issues. There's lots of books, perhaps, and there's a lot of folks who may be able to help you with navigating parts of those. But there are some unique things to agents that you actually do need to think about. You highlighted one, which is absolutely crucial, which is trust. We got to figure out a way to make sure that we know the agent does what it's supposed to. And it's that level of trust in its most trivial definition is actually hard to do. The other thing I would say is, and we touched on this perhaps a little bit in some of our previous episodes, is this notion of these agents are technology, they're applications effectively. They need to be able to be trusted and act like any other application in the enterprise. In other words, they need to have enterprise grade capability. You're not going to get reliability unless you have enterprise grade capability. You're not going to get the observability to diagnose the problems unless you have enterprise grade capability. You touched on security. You're not going to have security unless you have enterprise grade level identity and access control for your agents. These are all things that we technology folks, I'm a technology person at heart, we do that every single day. That is kind of the problems that we solve. They are exactly the same problems with slightly different personalities and personas, but the problems still need to be solved for agents. They need to have enterprise grade capability just like regular enterprise grade apps. They also need to have, if you're going to have a bunch of agents, Andy Jassy says there's going to be billions of them. Whether whether we ever get to a billion, who knows? But even if we're way off, we're going to have lots of these agents running around. They're going to be talking to each other, and we're going to have to implement some level of trust capability, some guardrails. Those are all ecosystem services. If I were to characterize them broadly, we need a common messaging fabric so we can get these things to actually talk. Probably maybe shared workspaces so they can actually talk together and collaborate. We probably need to have a catalog or a marketplace that lets people actually find the agents that they wish to engage with. We probably need to have a control layer that facilitates not just the human in the loop part, but also the human above the loop that's controlling and managing the agents. So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do around enterprise grade agent capability and enterprise grade agent ecosystem capabilities. Now, interesting enough, I think what this really says is for those that are on their agent or AI journey, I characterize it more as their AI journey as opposed to their agent journey. But very quickly you realize you're going to move from chatbot to a multi-agent system to an ecosystem of agents. And that's the level of thinking that you need to do. Some of this is covered under a book that's coming out in February called The Agentic Mesh, which is the reason for the podcast name up there. But it actually addresses some of these things. It's not a pitch necessarily for the book, but a lot of the stuff we've talked about are actually in that book. Now, I do want to take one last step, and I'll ask you a quick question here, John. Where should organizations start, and how should they start? How should they begin to participate? How can they win in the agent economy?
I think that's a great question. Let me turn it around. Whenever anybody asks me how they get somewhere, I ask them, well, do you know where you are? Because I can help you get a road from here to there. If you know where you are and you know where you want to go, let's talk about what you're missing to get from here to there. And so I always rely on my experience as a strategist. Where are we trying to go? Where are we today? And how do we get there? What's the roadmap to go from here to there? And I think we've talked about a lot of the challenges. There are data challenges, culture challenges, skills challenges, ecosystems are missing. These are all the kinds of challenges that most people and organizations face. And I think being honest about where you are allows you to decide where you want to invest and where you want to go. I always say this to a CEO or anybody at the board or important stakeholders in large organizations. If you had $1, where would you spend it? Would you fix some of these problems that you know you're going to need to solve? Or would you double down on something you're great at and ignore these other things? These are the kinds of options that you have when you're trying to direct an organization. And I think looking at it strategically and being honest by assessing your own maturity allows you to figure out where you want to go. Don't know if that's how I think about it. But let me ask you, how do you think about where organizations and people should start?
Well, it's kind of funny. It looks like we have the same playbook, but let me kind of elaborate on. First of all, I agree,
Oh, of
100%.
course we do. We've been
We've been
working
talking,
together
working
for a
together just a lot.
decade or so. And one of our first great projects together was let's lower the cost of all of the tech debt at this massive organization. It costs too much to run the business. We're not creating the new business. We're spending it all on running the business. And so, yes, we've had a
Yeah.
long history of strategic transformation.
Absolutely, but I mean, the truth of the matter though is we can call it a strategy, but you do have to know where you want to get to, why you want to get there, and then that vision or strategy needs to be accompanied with a practical roadmap. So I think that's effectively we are in the same movie, as they say. Here's what I would add to what you said. I remember a discussion, earlier this week or maybe a week previous, and you outlined what I called, I don't know what you called, the 4 Ps: plan, POC, pilot, production. And so here's kind of here's how I would use that and apply it to what we're talking about here, the agent economy. First off, a while ago, whether you needed 10 people or 2 people, you had timeframes that were very, very long. And what we're hypothesizing and what we're seeing is that the ability to iterate and the ability to experiment is quicker. So here's what I would say. I would say that as opposed to spending a year or longer in a typical type transformation initiative to get from plan, POC, pilot to production, I believe that we can apply that and use the other metaphor, crawl, walk, run, but do it a lot quicker. And the whole idea is the test and learn cycle, and then rinse and repeat, being able to do that much, much quicker. So really it boils down to, and I remember my very first data mesh implementation, data product implementation, the key to success was we had a nice boundary around what we wanted to do. We knew what the outcome was, and we had a very senior executive who ran the obstacle course for us to allow us to actually get moving. But the key thing there is we ended up doing it in relatively short, fast iterations. Short and fast for that period of time. With agent capability, I think the key to success is going from inside any of the plan, POC, pilot to production cycles quickly so that you can actually complete the end-to-end cycle much more frequently, faster, cheaper, and arguably better than before. So yes, start small, but think experiment, because the nature of experiments is you do these things when you're not necessarily sure of all the variables that you're dealing with, and you need to learn a bit to turn the knobs to the right level and such. So I mean, does that resonate to you?
Yeah, it's reminiscent of my time with a great company called Silicon Valley Data Science. And the company was acqui-hired by Apple. They're all at Apple now. But this is where I got to work with some of the great minds that I've been exposed to of data science. And we had a methodology, which was, listen, let's be business outcome focused. Let's plan what we're going to try to achieve. So that's the first P. The second is, well, let's prove with a proof of concept, the second P, that we can actually do what we think we can with AI. So, for example, let's prove that we could replace this trader with the logic of an AI agent. Let's prove that it could make the same decisions a human could make. And if we think we can do that, then let's evaluate, back to the trust, let's evaluate in the POC whether that works in principle. And then the third P, let's pilot that. And by pilot, I don't mean drive a plane. I mean pilot something, try something in market. So actually take your model in a small contained sandbox in the real world and pilot it to see if you can drive the outcome you expect. As you tune that, you realize, okay, I need to go back to the drawing board. I need to prove a few more things. I come back, I run another business pilot. And then finally, once I've piloted enough and understand the boundaries of how successful these AI agents or AI will be, then I can put it into production and then operate that over time. Once you've put something into production, the fourth P, you actually have something, you have a running experiment. That is called your business. And it doesn't end there, but that loop of going from planning, proving, piloting, and then production. Those are the 4 Ps of business experimentation that we used to talk about. And that's what we that's how I think about that piece of it.
Yeah. No, it's kind of funny because I'm looking back at some of the projects I've done. We never called it that, but we ended up doing exactly the same thing. Now, coming to today with clients that I have right now, we are using these tools, the cursors, Claude, and a few others, to allow us to radically transform how fast we can work. And I can concretely say that with the tools that we have at our disposal, what for us would have taken 2 people and probably 3 months, we can have one person do it in a week and have arguably something that is a better quality, and obviously faster and cheaper too. But these are the things that we're seeing right now. So even though we may not have used the exact words that you have there, the plan, POC, pilot, production, we are doing that uh, using the tools that we have, and we are actually seeing radically shortened delivery cycles. And as you shorten delivery cycles, we all know cost is typically proportional to that. We're reducing the costs, and we believe strongly that we're getting higher quality too. And if anything, through the iterations, we can find and diagnose problems much more rapidly. So the bottom line here is we are seeing in the work that we do, we're seeing the benefits of the agent. We are participating in the agent economy, and we're helping our clients actually participate in the agent economy. We're helping them remove some of their obstacles. We're helping them recognize and understand what the opportunity is. Where is that destination that they want to go? And once you have that dialogue, and you have a few proof points, everybody wants to participate in the agent economy. They think that's the only way that they can achieve the outcomes that they need, the benefits and the timeframes that they really want, as opposed to used to be able to do. They're realizing that the agent economy is not just here, but they actually want to become an active participant in it.
I agree.
And that's a wrap.
Great discussion, Eric. Thank you.
Good.